72-year-old Walter had been eating dinner alone for 8 years. His hands trembled slightly when he held the spoon now. Not from illness, just from age and quiet living. The house wasn't empty, it was neat. Organized, carefully maintained. But it didn't feel alive anymore. Every evening at exactly 6:30, he placed 2 plates on the table out of habit, then paused and gently returned one to the cabinet. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away when he was 64. She used to sit across from him and tell him the smallest details about her day, even after retirement. Back then, he would nod absent-mindedly. Now he would give anything to hear those tiny stories again. The strange thing about grief at his age was this: the world doesn't stop. The postman still comes, the neighbor's dog still barks, the sun still rises, but for Walter, time had quietly slowed down. Every Thursday at 4 p.m., Walter walked 3 blocks to the same small diner on Maple Street. He had been going there since Eleanor was alive. The waitress didn't ask what he wanted anymore. "Roast chicken, no gravy," she would say gently, already writing it down. Walter would nod with a polite half-smile. He always chose the corner booth by the window. From there, he could watch people passing by, couples arguing softly, teenagers laughing too loudly, young parents rushing with strollers. Sometimes he imagined what their futures would look like. He wondered if they knew how fast the years would move, how one day the chair across from them might be empty too. He never spoke much while he ate. He would simply sit, chew slowly, and listen to the sound of other people's conversations filling the air, noise that reminded him he was still part of the world. One Thursday, as Walter slowly stirred his coffee, someone paused beside his booth. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. "Do you mind if I sit here? It's quite full today." Walter looked up and saw a woman, perhaps 68 or 69, with silver hair neatly pinned back and kind but tired eyes. She held her purse close to her chest, like someone who wasn't used to asking for space. He cleared his throat. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the seat across from him, the seat that had been empty for 8 years. For a brief second as she sat down, something inside him tightened. It felt unfamiliar, almost like guilt, as if he were replacing a memory. The woman smiled politely. "Thank you." "I'm Margaret," she said. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone who had also learned to live with silence. "I'm Walter," he replied, his voice steady but gentle. For a few seconds, they both focused on their coffee, the soft clinking of cups filling the space where words hadn't arrived yet. Margaret broke the silence first. "Do you come here often?" she asked, not in a curious way, more like someone who already knew the answer. Walter gave a small nod. "Every morning, 8 years now." He didn't explain what happened 8 years ago. He didn't need to. Something in his tone said enough. Margaret's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "I started coming here last month," she admitted, "after my husband passed. The house was too quiet." Walter looked at her properly then, not just as a stranger at his table, but as someone who understood the weight of evenings that feel longer than they should. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only person in the room carrying that weight. From that morning on, it became routine. Margaret would arrive at 7:45. Walter would already be there at 7:30. They never discussed the timing, but neither of them was ever late. They didn't talk about big things at first. They talked about the weather, about the old bakery that used to be on Main Street, about how music doesn't sound the same on the radio anymore. Small conversations, but they filled a very big silence. One morning, Margaret noticed Walter wince slightly as he stood up. "Your knee?" she asked gently. He smiled, a little embarrassed. 72 years old, he said. "Some parts don't listen to me anymore." She laughed softly. "I'm 68, she replied, "and my back stopped cooperating years ago." It wasn't flirtation. It was something better, honesty without pretending to be younger than they were. As they walked out of the cafe side by side that day, the young barista watched them through the window. 2 older strangers moving slowly down the street, but somehow walking lighter than before. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with a second cup of coffee. A week later, Margaret didn't show up. Walter sat at the usual table, hands wrapped around his cup long after the coffee had gone cold. He told himself she was probably visiting family. Still, The chair across from him felt heavier than usual. On the third day of her absence, he caught himself looking at the door every few seconds. It surprised him how quickly someone could become part of your morning. At 72, he thought he had already lived all the chapters that mattered. When Margaret finally returned, she looked tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes. "Doctor's appointments," she said lightly when he asked. "Nothing dramatic. Just reminders that we are not 20 anymore." Walter nodded, but something shifted inside him. Later that day, instead of going straight home, he stopped by a small bookstore and bought a thin poetry collection. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't bought poetry in 30 years. The next morning, he placed the book gently on the cafe table. "I thought," he said quietly, "maybe we could read something together." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, not at the book, but at him, and smiled in a way that made the entire room feel warmer than the coffee ever could. Margaret opened the poetry book slowly, as if it was something fragile. Walter adjusted his glasses, his 72-year-old hands trembling just slightly, not from age this time, but from anticipation. They took turns reading. The words weren't about youth or passion. They were about time, about waiting, about finding something gentle when you least expect it. When Walter finished one particular poem about late blossoms, his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "It's never too late," she said softly, "for anything that feels real." That afternoon, as they stepped outside the cafe together, Walter noticed something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't walking alone anymore. People passed by without noticing them, just two older strangers on a sidewalk. But to him, it felt like the beginning of something brand new. Weeks turned into months. They kept meeting every morning. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence. And one evening, as the sun lowered behind the small houses on his quiet street, Walter realized something simple but powerful. He was no longer waiting for life to end. He was waiting for tomorrow. At 72, Walter had learned a truth many people half his age still don't understand. Loneliness doesn't always need to be cured by noise, by crowds, or by youth. Sometimes it only takes one person to sit across from you, look into your eyes, and remind you that your story isn't over yet.